Hopefully you can see it. Okay. So in terms of questions, wait, I'll change that. In terms of questions, I don't really mind. Maybe it's better to do a clarification question during and kind of bigger question in the end, if that's okay. Okay. So thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, Jenny, Alex, and Noah, for organizing this great workshop. I've already learned a bunch of useful things yesterday. So I'm going to talk about the bidirectional relation between cognitive biases and morphological marking. So you see the next slide, right? Sorry, I'm a bit okay. Teams messed up with me. So the big questions I'm interested in general in my research, have to do with this bidirectional relation between language learning or cognitive biases more generally and language structure. So the way languages actually look like. So that means I'm interested in the way linguistic input impacts our learning on the one hand, and on the other hand, the way our learning biases shape languages and language structure over time. Now, I portray this here as kind of two distinct processes, but I think following many others, it might be better to think about this as this one cycle. So we learn languages, we change them during that learning, and then we have to learn them again and again. But today I'm going to talk about these two processes as distinct processes, and I'm going to present two studies kind of exemplifying each one of these processes. So what I'm going to do today is present two studies. The first study is about then the advantage that morphological marking can confer for learners. And the case study is going to be the impact of redundant case marking on learning of thematic assignment, so learning who is doing what to whom. And the second study then is about how our learning impacts structure. So it's about the impact of learning biases on the emergence of morphological marking systems. And here the case study is going to be the impact of information structure on the emergence of differential object marking systems. Okay, and in both studies, I'm going to use both studies use artificial language learning experiments, and I'm going to try to highlight how these are actually very critical to ask the type of questions, the research questions that I'm dealing with here. Okay, so the first study was done within Balaonon. It's about whether learners benefit from redundant morphological marking. So what I'm going to talk about here in this study, in a nutshell, I'm going to present you some sort of a puzzle. So on the one hand, languages seem to display morphological redundancy, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. But on the other hand, redundancy seems to be dispreferred in language use. So when we look at the way speakers use language, they seem to avoid redundancy. Now, if we do think that there is some sort of a connection between the way languages actually look like and the way we language users use language, then this calls for an explanation. And I'm going to try to offer one, specifically that redundancy can benefit learning. Okay, so this is the study in the nutshell, but let's start from the beginning. What do I mean by redundancy? So here's a definition given by Claude Shannon, the founding father of information theory. So redundancy is the measure of the extent to which it is possible to compress a message if the best possible code is used. So in other words, lengthening a signal, and when we talk about a signal, when we apply this definition to language, then lengthening a signal means adding linguistic material. So when we add linguistic material, but we don't change the message, we increase redundancy. And the opposite, if we reduce linguistic material, but the message doesn't change, then we reduce redundancy. And what's very nice about this definition is that it captures different instances or different manifestations of redundancy across different levels of linguistic analysis. And indeed, different researchers have used this definition to talk about, to refer to redundancy in different levels of linguistic analysis. So starting from articulation length and morphology and referential choice and syntax and more. But here I'm going to focus on morphological redundancy, also following previous research. So in terms of morphological redundancy, then, that means that adding a morpheme without any change. So here adding linguistic material means adding a morpheme. So adding a morpheme without any change to the message is amounted to increasing redundancy. Okay. So having this definition in mind, we can now turn to look at the way languages look like with respect to redundancy. And what we see is that redundant marking is attested cross-linguistically. So I'm just going to give a few examples. The first, a very prominent one, is agreement. So if we look at English as an example, the man walks. So the S morpheme here signals the third person singular, but all of this information is in fact can be deduced from the subject, and the subject is obligatory in English. So in that sense, this S morpheme adds linguistic material, but doesn't add any more information, so it's redundant. Another example is multiple exponents. So this is a linguistic name for the phenomenon of that different languages have, where they use multiple morphological markers to mark the same meaning at once. So here's an example for such a language spoken in northern Mexico called Choguita Raramuri. And in this language, for a certain set of verbs, you can use just one derivational morpheme or two, and importantly, the meaning doesn't change. So if you use this additional morpheme, it adds a morpheme, but it doesn't add any more information, therefore it's redundant. Okay, final example is an example that I'm going to use in my study, is having both fixed word order and case marking to indicate who's doing what to whom. So if your language already has fixed word order, basically all the sufficient information is already there. You can already know who's doing what to whom in transitive constructions. So case marking adds a morpheme, but doesn't add any more information. So in that sense, again, it is redundant. Okay, so redundant marking is attested cross-linguistically, redundant morphological marking. But when we think about this from a cognitive perspective, or when we look at the way speakers use language, this seems puzzling because redundancy seems to be disfavored. So first of all, redundancy seems to add complexity to language systems, right? It adds more elements to take care of and monitor and produce while we use languages. And there are many different definitions to language complexity, but morphological redundancy taps into many of them. So at least it seems to add more complexity to language systems. And moreover, when we look at language use, speakers tend to avoid redundancy when they use languages. And there's a great volume of studies suggesting that. So more predictable elements are more likely to be contracted or omitted in language use. So the more predictable a linguistic element is, the more likely it is to be kind of contracted or simply to go away when speakers use language. And this is a very robust finding, again, cross-linguistically and across different levels of linguistic analysis. But I'm going to give an example for morphology for the current purposes. So for example, the alternation between full morphemes and contracted morphemes in English has also shown to be predicted by the predictability of the words. So morphemes are more likely to be contracted when the meaning of the contracted word is predictable given its surrounding words. So if it's very predictable to have a not, then the not is more likely to be contracted. So in other words, speakers are trying to spare effort, typically, the way they use language. Whenever they can, they tend to reduce and omit. So they tend to avoid redundancy. So why is it then that redundancy is attested cross-linguistically? So to think about this, we need to think about what renders redundancy functional. And I would like to argue that learning circumstances are such circumstances. Now, prototypically, if we think about the way learning circumstances and specifically language learning circumstances look like, prototypically, it involves these two types of agents, this asymmetric interaction between two types of agents. So we have the proficient speaker on the one hand, and this is the person with a proficient or adequate knowledge of the language, and we have the learner on the other hand, the person with the inferior knowledge of the language. And here the learner is depicted as a child, but this doesn't have to be the case, and I'll get back to this in a moment. So my prediction is in fact related to both agents in this interaction. So from the proficient speaker perspective, talking to the learner, my prediction is that this person uses more redundancy when she talks to learners as opposed to other proficient speakers. And from the learner perspective, my prediction is that this redundancy is actually helpful. So redundancy should be beneficial for language learning. And I've tested both of these predictions in recent years, but today I'm just going to talk about this side of the interaction, so whether redundancy benefits learning. Now, following up this question, an immediate follow-up question arises, or at least it has arisen for me, which is whether adult and child learners are alike with respect to redundancy. So there are different reasons to think that they might differ. Adult and child learners often show different learning and cognitive biases. There are different types of learners with different types of experiences. So it could be yet another case where adult and children show different learning biases. But in particular, there's this very prominent theory in the linguistic literature that has a specific prediction with respect to the impact of redundancy on children and adult learners. And this is the linguistic niche hypothesis by Lupien and Dale. So Lupien and Dale in 2010 looked at about 2,000 languages, and they found that languages with more L2 speakers, that is, languages that are spoken by communities where a bigger proportion of the learners were adult learners as opposed to child learners. So these languages spoken by these communities have less complex morphology. And the reason I'm bringing up this seemingly different topic is the explanation Lupien and Dale offered to account this finding. And what they suggested is that children and adults should differ in the impact of redundancy on learning. So in particular, child learners are predicted to benefit from redundancy, while adult learners are predicted not to, or at least not to the same degree. So the idea is that languages adapt themselves over time to accommodate the needs of their users, of the type of communities that use them. So languages spoken by communities where there are more child learners will over time preserve redundancy because redundancy is predicted to benefit child learners, whereas communities that are spoken by a bigger population of adult learners are predicted over time to get rid of redundancies because redundancy is predicted not to benefit adult learners. So this is a very interesting and intriguing hypothesis, and it has no empirical support so far as to the postulated differences between child and adult learners. So now the research questions then are A, whether redundancy benefits learning, and B, whether we find these differences between children and adults in line with the linguistic niche hypothesis, namely whether it benefits child learners more than it does adult learners. Okay, zooming out a bit, what do we know about redundancy in learning in the first place? So we know that redundant cues, having multiple or redundant cues, is beneficial for learning. It has been shown for different cognitive domains. So for example, there are more examples, but for vision and category formation and even language learning. So different studies done on the effect of multiple cues on language learning, including this very nice one, use different sets of multimodal cues. So in this study, for example, do you see my cursor, by the way? Okay, no, never mind. Okay, so in the Monahan 2017 study, they use pointing as a redundant cue and show that it benefits learning. But if you think about pointing, it's a redundant cue that is not part of the system it's not a part of the entity to be learned. You do not have to learn this cue in and of itself. And this is not the case with redundant morphological cues, right? So if you have a case marking in your language, you have to learn it as part of your language. You have to reconstruct it and reproduce it. And that's why we often think about redundant morphological cues as ones that make languages more complicated. So the question here is whether also redundant morphological cues will benefit learning. And the prediction, our prediction here is that they will, despite their added complexity. Okay, and to test that, we looked at the transitive construction, so specifically at learning of thematic assignment, of learning, figuring out who's doing what to whom. And two very prominent cues that typically do this job cross-linguistically are word order and case marking. So these are the cues that we're going to be looking at. And there's very interesting cross-linguistic developmental literature that is very relevant to this question, showing that children seem to benefit from having more cues in their input as opposed to less cues. So if a child in their language, if there's a possibility of having both word order and case marking to indicate who's doing what to whom, they typically benefit from having both of them in the sentence in case it's possible to have just one of them. So this is in line with our hypothesis here, but importantly, it turns out that the redundant form is, so the form that has like more cues as opposed to one cue is usually also the prototypical and the most frequent form in the input directed to children. So we can't really tell, judging by this data, whether children benefit from redundancy per se, or whether it's just their increased familiarity with these types of constructions. So an artificial language learning experiments can allow us to tease these two options apart. And specifically here, we're using what's often called, and I think in yesterday's introduction, it was also mentioned, the ease of learning paradigm. So comparing learning accuracy across conditions. I'm going to compare how a system is learned when it has redundancy as opposed to when it doesn't have redundancy. And of course, I cannot do this. I cannot compare two natural languages this way. Okay. So how did it work? We recruited both children and adults to this task. So we had 60 children and 56 adults. All of them were Hebrew speakers. This was done in Jerusalem. And the language we taught them was semi-artificial. So this might be something that Katie Schuler will talk about in her tutorial today, but this study had to suit child learners to begin with. So it had to be learned quite easily, and it had to be very short, both because children have a very limited amount of patience, but also because we run in Jerusalem and in Baal Arnon's lab, we run our studies typically on children in the Living Lab Museum. So it's which is part of the Science Museum in Jerusalem. So children and adults come to this lab as visitors in the Science Museum, and we can't hold them for long. So this experiment, we had to teach children this language rather quickly, under 10 minutes. So to facilitate learning, we gave them semi-artificial lexicon. So it was Hebrew nouns with artificial suffixes, weird alien artificial suffixes. And importantly, this language also had fixed OSV word order, which is very non-Hebrew-like. Hebrew is SVO. So all the participants in our study received this language, but we wanted to test the impact of having a redundant morpheme on learning. So participants, both children and adults, were randomly assigned to one of two conditions, which were essentially two versions of the same language. So the first version was what we call the redundant language. This language had case marking on all of the objects. So this means this language had two cues to indicate who's doing what to whom, both fixed word order and case marking. The other language, which we call the control language, did not have case marking. So it had only one cue, just fixed word order. So other than this difference, this language is, both of these languages were completely the same, and the exposure to these languages was the same. So this is the experimental flow. I don't want to go over all of this. Participants were exposed to the language and then they were tested on it. I just want to show you a trial in the sentence comprehension test. So participants heard sentences. They did not see them written down, going back to that discussion from yesterday. This is just for a demonstration. So participants heard sentences, and these sentences either had or did not have this case marking, depending on the condition. And it was simply a two alternative forced choice task. So they had to choose the correct picture matching the sentence they just heard based on their training. And these two choices were always mirror images of each other. So it's either the clown touching the painter or the painter touching the clown. That's their task. We then made sure that they actually, so specifically for the participants in the redundant condition, it was critical to see that they learned and reproduced the language properly and that they noticed and reproduced the cue. So they also had a sentence production phase afterwards where they saw the picture and they had to produce the entire sentence describing it themselves. Okay. What I'm going to show you now is the results from their comprehension test. So the results of children and adults splitted to the two conditions, and this is what we got. So as you can see, for children, the redundant condition was much better. So in both conditions were above chance. Having just one cue, just a fixed word order, is essentially good enough to understand who's doing what to whom. But it seems like children in the control condition were simply very varied. So some children got this, some children not so much, but children in the redundant condition pretty much excelled it. Moving on to the adults, the pattern seems to be in the same direction, but we can't really tell. The adults in both groups were very close to ceiling, and we cannot detect any effect here. And this goes back to what Jamie White was saying yesterday about this difficulty in this paradigm, that ease of learning paradigm, where you really have to find a balance where it's not, the input is not too difficult and not too easy. But here there was this further complication that this input had to feed both children and both child and adult learners. And of course, what's good for children will be easier for adults. So you see this in action now. So the redundant condition was better for children. We cannot tell whether it was better for adults. So to wrap up this study, we can see that having a redundant morpheme can benefit learning, despite the fact that it added complexity to the language. And it supports this idea of the linguistic niche hypothesis with regard to children. So the linguistic niche hypothesis had this novel suggestion that redundancy should benefit child learners, and we see that here. But we do not know, we cannot tell based on this data whether adult learners benefit less from redundancy or whether they behave any differently here. So this is still an open question that I'm still exploring. Okay, moving on now to the next study. So this study now is going to be about the way our learning shapes, or participants' learning shapes input. And this study was done with Kenny Smith, Jennifer Culbertson, Eitan Grossman, and Inbal Arnon. And it's about the impact of information structure on the emergence of differential object marking. Okay, so in this study, what I'm going to talk about is the emergence of differential object marking, but henceforth DOM, because it's a mouthful, in the lab. And this is a very interesting case because there are two interesting hypotheses at play here. The first one is that DOM is driven by disambiguation. I'm going to say a lot of words now that I'm going to explain what they mean very soon. And the second one is that DOM is driven by atypical information structure. Now, what's interesting is that there's recent evidence coming from an artificial language learning experiment supporting the account that DOM is driven by disambiguation. But there's even more recent, or there's a lot of evidence now coming from the linguistic literature suggesting that DOM, in fact, is driven by atypical information structure. So there is some sort of a mismatch here between evidence coming from an artificial language learning experiment and evidence coming from the linguistic literature. So our study here is going to tap into this discrepancy. Okay, so first of all, what is differential object marking? So DOM languages are languages that mark only certain types of direct objects. And this is quite a frequent phenomenon, so over 300 languages do it. And importantly, so they mark only certain types of objects, but this marking is not random. So this marking is typically dependent on some property of the object. So here's an example for such a language, Spanish. In Spanish, there's this marking here, and it goes along apparently only with human objects like woman, but not with inanimate objects like house. So in Spanish, this marking is determined by the animacy of the object. But in other languages, other properties of the objects condition this marking. So for example, in Hebrew, in my native language, the definiteness of the object determines whether it will be marked or not. Okay, so this is DOM. And then the question is, how do such systems develop? So why would languages develop these weird systems where only certain types of the objects are marked and the rest are unmarked? And this question has been keeping linguists busy for a long time. And one very prominent account is that DOM develops as a way to prevent ambiguity, so to distinguish the agent from the patient. And this might echo the previous study I was telling you about. Just a note in brackets, I'm going to, from now on, typically use subject and object and not agent and patient, not because there are no differences between these two terms, but for the current study for convenience, I will use subject and object because the distinction is not very critical for this study. Okay, so here the idea is that DOM develops as a way to distinguish subjects from objects or agents from patients. So imagine I'm about to tell you something about an event that involves a woman, a ball, and kicking. It would probably be very easy for you to guess what I'm about to say. So it's probably the woman kicking the ball rather than the other way around. But if what I would like to tell you is about a woman, a man, and kicking, then that's now more difficult. And I have to make sure somehow in the language I speak that I can kind of be accurate, give you all the that you can distinguish between, you can understand who's doing what to whom, that you have all the information possible to do this distinction. So in this case, let's say the woman is kicking the man. So I'm speaking English now, and in English, the way English does this is with word order. So the subjects are placed in the first position in the sentence, so you can always know who's doing what to whom because the doer is typically in the first position of the sentence. But this doesn't have to be the case, and other languages use other means, and object marking, or object case marking can be, the claim is that this is yet another way to distinguish between subjects and objects. So the hypothesis is that DOM arises as a means to do that. And so the prediction is that we should see DOM where it is needed, namely where there is ambiguity, like having two animates involved in a transitive action. Okay, so this account was supported in a very cool study done in 2012 by Fedotchkina, Yeager, and Newport. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this study because our study is going to kind of follow up on this one and use the same paradigm. So in this study, participants were taught the language for 4 days. So they got extensive training, and they received as input a complicated language that had variation. So this language had flexible word order, either SOV or OSV. In this language, subjects could only be animates, so they could only refer to animate characters, but objects could refer to either animate or inanimate objects. And this language, importantly, had optional case marking. So it appeared only on objects. So wherever you saw a marking, you could tell that it's an object, but it did not appear on all objects. It appeared on just 60% of the objects. So in that sense, it's like DOM, a marking that appears on only part of the objects, but unlike DOM in natural languages, it was unconditioned by any other property of the objects. So it was unconditioned, importantly, for this experiment by the animacy of the object. It just randomly appeared on some of the objects. So that means that the language that they created was not terribly efficient. It contained ambiguity. So in cases where the objects were animates and there was no case marking, like the man kicking, like the woman kicking men event, participants had no way of figuring out who's doing what to whom. If you hear the sentence in this language not coupled with a image, you can't tell really whether it's the man kicking the woman or the woman kicking the man. And the prediction of the researchers was that if indeed DOM arises as a way to reduce ambiguity, then participants, learners of this language, should use this object marking they were given in the language to reduce ambiguity in an efficient way. And the way to do this is to introduce animacy conditioned case marking. So to start conditioning the object marking on the property of animacy. In particular, to increase marking for animate objects, because these are the instances where this object marking is needed to reduce ambiguity. Is this clear so far? You can definitely stop me if not. Okay. So indeed, this is what they found. So learners changed their input, or more accurately, deviated from the input they received to make the language less ambiguous. And this is a plot taken from their paper. It's a bit scruffy here. I'm sorry about that. What you can see is the proportion of object marking throughout in participants' outputs and the way they described images throughout the testing days. And you can see the animate objects in red and the inanimate ones in blue. So participants increased the use of object marking throughout the days for the animate objects, but reduced it for inanimate objects. So they created this efficient DOM system that is conditioned by animacy and reduces ambiguity. And another thing they found that will be important for later on is that participants also conditioned their object marking by their choice of word order. So participants could use either SOV or OSV in their productions, just like in their input. And as it turns out, whenever they used OSV in red, they used more, they tended more to use object marking compared to when they used SOV. And then there they tended to decrease object marking. Okay. Okay. So this is very cool. This is an artificial language learning experiment that supported a linguistic hypothesis in the lab, which is what we're all about here. But apparently, this account, so the disambiguation account, has been challenged on different fronts ever since the study came out. So first of all, from the linguistic literature, it turns out that it's actually very rare cross-linguistically to find languages that are in which DOM is primarily driven by disambiguation. So you find cases where there is marking even though it is not needed, so redundant marking. And you also find the opposite cases where it would really help to have marking to disambiguate, but you don't find it there. So it's very rare to actually find languages that in which DOM is triggered by disambiguation. And also looking at the chronic data, so linguists that look at how languages actually develop, suggest that even in the minority of cases where DOM seems to be a minority of systems that do seem to be in line with this disambiguation account, then DOM, the system actually started from a different source. What source? I'll get to that soon. So the chronic evidence also doesn't support this account. And more recently, in a study done by Smith and Culbertson, so Smith and Culbertson replicated Fedotchkina et al. Study and used in different conditions. And what they found is that participants' behavior, namely participants' tendency to overmark animate objects, is actually not driven by disambiguation, but something else, not during learning. I'll get back to this as well. So overall, there are reasons to be skeptical about this account, about the disambiguation account as an account which tries to explain the emergence of DOM systems. Okay, so if not disambiguation, what else? What other accounts are they? So there's another prominent account that suggests that DOM starts from marking atypical objects. So this is basically like a subcase of the more general idea of predictability-based marking, or markedness, if you prefer. So languages tend to mark less expected forms with more linguistic material. And the idea here is that DOM is no exception to that. So less predicted objects, the less typical types of objects should receive more linguistic material. So in that case, should receive object marking. So what makes objects typical or atypical? So objects can be atypical in many ways. So if we go back to the animacy example, most objects are inanimate. So typically balls are objects. That means that animate objects are not typical. So the idea is that this case of having a man as the entity being kicked, it's marked not because we need to distinguish between the agent and the patient and understand who's doing what to whom. It's simply marked because it's atypical, because it's a less frequent state of affairs. So animacy is one example, but objects can be atypical in other ways. And apparently, what's very important for DOM, for the emergence of DOM, is atypical objects with respect to information structure. Now, what is information structure? Information structure now shifts us from semantics to a field of more pragmatics and discourse. And information structure is about the way we regulate information and conversation. So where we enter new information and where we reiterate old information. So how does atypical or typical state of affairs with respect to information structure look like? So here's an example for a typical state of affairs. Let's imagine I say something like, I met Helena yesterday. So I introduce Helena the first time in this conversation in the object position. And then I say something like, Helena is so nice. So now Helena, who's already old information, appears in the subject position. And information structure, people typically distinguish between old and topical information, but for the current purposes, we're going to collapse them together because we're not interested. The distinction is not relevant for this study. So the typical state of affairs is having new information in the object position and old information in the subject position. What is the atypical state of affairs? Basically, having it the other way around. So let's say I introduce Helena into the conversation for the first time by saying, Helena is so nice. And then I met Helena yesterday. So new information here appears in the subject position, and given information here appears in the object position. And that's the atypical thing. It's weird. It happens just as sometimes animate objects happen, but it's less typical and it's less frequent and therefore atypical. So these are the type of cases that are predicted to bring about these DOM systems. And indeed, object marking in different languages is impacted by information structure. In the way I just said. So atypical objects, which mean in this case, given our topical objects, are marked more compared to new objects. And this is not a negligent phenomenon. So in this cross-linguistic study on DOM systems, it has been found that information structure is the primary driving force for DOM cross-linguistically. So typically in natural languages, there are several factors at play. But information structure is the primary driving force in most of the DOM systems found. Okay, and moreover, it was suggested as a diachronic source for DOM. So as I hinted out earlier, even languages that synchronically have DOM systems that are governed by semantic properties, so like animacy in Spanish, even those types of languages are argued, those type of systems are argued to stem from information structure. Now, how does marking that is dependent on information structure evolve over time to be conditioned by animacy? I can talk about this more during question time if you're interested, and I will go back to this later. Okay, so there is an artificial language learning experiment that supports the disambiguation account, but recent linguistic literature supports the information structure account. So what we wanted to do is kind of to bring the information structure account to the lab and see whether we can show emergence of differential object marking as a result of atypical information structure. Yeah. So to do this, we conducted an artificial language learning study, and the artificial language learning study we conducted was modeled after the Fedotchkina et al. Experiment I was telling you about. And as you probably noticed, it uses a different paradigm than the paradigm of the experiment I told you about in the first study. So this uses the regularization paradigm. So in this paradigm, we're not comparing two types of systems. We give participants input that contains some unconditioned variation. And what we want to see is how they deviate from their input throughout learning over time. And what would be very cool and great is if participants turn out to change their language, so to deviate from their input in a way that is compatible with what we see in natural languages, because that could allow us to link typology with learning biases or different biases as we kind of conduct them in the lab. Okay, so if object marking is impacted by information structure, then speakers should increase marking for given objects. Okay, so to do this, we recruited 43 English-speaking participants, and this study was run online on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And Kenny and I are going to talk about these kind of platforms in our upcoming tutorial. And again, following previous experiments, this was a 4-day session. So participants received extensive training. And this language also was complicated and had variation. So it had 8 nouns, all of them referred here to animate characters because we did not want to have an animacy distinction here, but a different distinction. And 4 verbs, and it had 2 types of word orders, again, OSV, sorry, and SOV. And importantly, again, participants had one optional case marking. So this case marking appeared only on objects, but again, it appeared only on half of the objects here. And the object marking was not conditioned on any other property of the language. So again, very unlike natural cases of DOM. And importantly, what we wanted to test here is information structure. So we had an information structure manipulation. And the way we did that is that before each sentence, and sentences corresponded to images of transitive constructions, of transitive actions. So before each sentence, one of the characters, a character appeared, and this character turned out to be the object in half of the trials or the subject in half of the trials. And that's how we made characters given. So in half of the trials, the object was given, and in half of the trials, the subject was given. So this is how it looked like. For example, participants saw this painter, and then they saw this painter involved in some action. So in this case, the painter is punching the chef. So this is an example of a typical state of affairs with respect to information structure, because you see the painter, and then you see the painter in the subject position. So the subject is given here, and that's typical. Compare this with a situation where you see a painter, and then you see something is done to the painter. So here the chef punches the painter. So painter, the chef punched the painter. This is an example of an atypical state of affairs from the perspective of information structure, because the old information here appears in the object position. And these are the cases that are predicted to receive increased marking. Okay. So this is the procedure of the experiment. And again, I don't want to go through each one of the steps, but just to show you that participants did this entire thing every day of the experiment, but testing was only on days 2, 3, and 4. Production testing. During exposure, so participants saw these sentences, and again, before each sentence, always one of the character, either the subject or the object, occurred. And during exposure, these images were coupled with sentences in the artificial language. But then in the final production test, and this is the test we're interested in, participants again saw a character, then saw this character as being either the doer of the action or someone that the action is done to. And they had to type in the description of the sentence themselves based on the language they were trained on. They just received the verb as a prompt. So this is what we're looking at here in this paradigm, their productions. And specifically, we want to look at how they use case marking. So whether the case marking in their input was random, but we want to see whether they started conditioning case marking on some other property of the language. Okay, so what I will show you now is participants' productions. So it's participants' proportion of object marking in their productions throughout the testing days, and split it to the instances where the object is new. So again, this is that I'm reiterating it because I know it's difficult to grasp it. The cases where the information structure is typical. So painter punched chef, as opposed to cases where the object is given, the atypical state of affairs. So painter, chef punched painter. And again, the prediction is that these turquoise given objects should be marked more. And this is what we found. So it does seem to be the case that given objects are marked more, but the differences here are in fact quite small, and we did not detect any significant effect of information structure on object marking, which is unfortunate. It was not in line with our predictions. But we further investigated participants' outputs. So as I told you earlier, the type of word order can also impact the proportion of object marking. So here, what I'll show you is the proportion of object marking in participants' productions splitted to the instances where they chose to produce SOV, in the cases where they chose to produce OSV. And what we found is that, just like in the previous experiment by Fedechkina et al. I was telling you about, objects were case marked more in OSV. So whenever participants chose to produce OSV, they could produce both. They tended more to use object marking. And this is a repeated finding in artificial language learning studies, both in the Fedechkina et al. Study and other studies using similar paradigms. Now, why is it? Why is it that participants tend to increase object marking for OSV word orders? So one possibility is that this reflects a general cognitive preference for S initial word order. So OSV is indeed very rare cross-linguistically, and there's a large body of work showing that language users might have a bias against OSV or in favor of S initial word order, which could also explain this typological distribution of word orders. So this tendency to overmark OSV sentences could just reflect that. But another possibility, and I want to bring this up here because I'm not sure this type of consideration was brought up until now in this workshop, and this is a kind of issue that is very prominent when you design an artificial language learning experiment. So another possibility is what we see here is a reflection of participants' native language. So in all of these experiments showing increased object marking in OSV sentences, all of the participants were always English speakers. And English has an S initial word order. So maybe OSV is weird for these participants for this reason, and that's why they overmark it. So this is something to think about. Our study is not designed to kind of pick what's the correct explanation here, but both of these could explain this tendency. Okay, so going back to our results. So we found increased object marking for OSV sentences, but now what made participants choose to produce OSV as opposed to SOV? So we next wanted to see whether our manipulation of information structure had in fact impacted participants' choice of word order. So what I will show you now on the y-axis is the proportion of OSV, so not object marking anymore, but OSV as opposed to SOV. And again, split it to the instances where the object is new, so painter, painter, punch, chef, the typical state of affairs in purple, and the atypical state of affairs in turquoise, so painter, chef, punch, painter. This is what we found. So indeed, information structure impacted the choice of word order. We saw more over time, participants tended to use OSV more for given objects. So for cases like painter, chef, punch, painter, in a trial like that, participants opted to describe the image of a chef punching a painter to start the production with the painter, with the object when it was given. So in other words, participants preferred to start their production with a given element. If the object was new, so if the given element was in the subject position, they preferred to start their productions with the subject, namely to use SOV. But if the object was given, they tended to prefer to use OSV, so to start with the object. And this, again, is in line with what we already know. So we know that word order is influenced by information structure cross-linguistically. And in particular, we know that there is this general cognitive preference to place given information before new information. We see it in corpus studies of language use, and we see it in psycholinguistic studies. Okay. We make of all of this pattern of results. We saw no direct effect of information structure on case marking. This is contra our expectation, our prediction, and contra the prediction, this general idea that atypical objects should receive overt marking. But we saw an indirect effect, one that goes through word order. So we saw that word order was impacted by information structure. So given objects gave rise to OSV word orders, and that case marking was in turn impacted by word order. So whenever participants used OSV, they tended to use more object marking. And apparently, this stage procedure that goes through a change of word order is actually in line with several documented cases of emergence of DOM in the wild, in natural languages. So within this general account, suggesting that information structure impacts object marking, there is a more like a niche account suggesting that the procedure is actually staged and it involves a change of word order. So I'm going to show you a demonstration of that. I'm going to show you a demonstration of the processes that languages are claimed to be going through in this process. This is just going to be a caricature example. So of course, natural languages are much more messier than that, but this is just for demonstration. So bear with me here. So imagine the language we're talking about has an SOV word order. The first stage the language might go through with respect to information structure is having the given objects move to what's called a topical position. That means having word order reflect atypical information structure, right? So the object now precedes the subject. I'm sorry, there was something messy there. It's supposed to be subject, object, verb, and then the object precedes the subject. Okay, so some languages stop there in this stage. In fact, many languages that we refer to as flexible word order languages are in fact languages in which word order is simply impacted by information structure. So that's the first stage. Some languages move on to a second stage, where these fronted constructions, so now this object appearing in atypical position, receives case marking. So this is what we see here. In some languages, stop here. So in some languages, object marking is restricted to cases where the object is atypical with respect to information structure and it appears in a non-canonical position. Some languages go through an additional third stage where this marking now expands to other properties of objects. So it's no longer restricted to objects that are atypical with respect to information structure and appear in non-canonical position, but now the marking is conditioned by animacy, for example. And again, how does that process happen? I'd be happy to talk about this during question time if you're interested. But what we see here in terms of our experiment is that the initial stages of the process were simulated in the lab. So we saw the first two stages and the given before new and marking of atypical word order. And we have kind of a good account for each one of them on their own. So the next step is to see then whether we can actually simulate also the third step. So whether we can show in the lab that atypical information structure can lead eventually to semantic-based DOM. So we try to do this in a follow-up study. We conducted a rather complicated artificial language learning experiment to try to bring participants to this final stage, but we didn't succeed so far. We found no evidence, but you can ask me more about this later if you're interested. But that's the idea. We simulated 2 out of the 3 stages that languages can go through in the emergence of DOM out of atypical information structure. Okay, so to wrap up this study about cognitive biases and DOM, so I mentioned 2 types of cognitive biases that could be at play. The first one is the disambiguation bias, and we saw that it can drive the emergence of DOM in the lab, and it may play a role in natural languages, even though some linguists are skeptical of that. And there's the bias of atypical information structure, and we saw that it drives the emergence of DOM in natural languages, and we did see evidence that it may drive DOM in the lab through a process of change of word order. So how can we reconcile the existence of both of these biases with respect to DOM? So one possibility is that these 2 biases tap into different aspects of language use. So Smith and Culbertson in their study from 2020 showed that disambiguation is actually not operative during learning, but it is during communication. So it can be, it's possible that disambiguation is important for communication. So when you're talking to someone, you really have to make sure that they understand who is doing what to whom, that they get it right. But it's not, but maybe in learning, atypical information structure is important, as we saw the impact of learning on that in the current experiment. Another possibility, they're not mutually exclusive, is that these 2 biases of disambiguation and information structure tap into different stages of the same process. So it can be that atypical information structure is responsible for kind of bringing about these systems in the first place. But then once they're there, they're kind of useful for disambiguation. So disambiguation could be a driving force for kind of keeping them there. So this is a thought for now. Okay, so more generally, talking about both of these studies together. So I've shown you in the first study that morphological marking can benefit learning. And in the second study, that our learning can shape and can change patterns of morphological marking. And again, I'm talking about these as 2 distinct kind of processes, but this joins a lot of work showing that we can maybe treat this as a cycle. So we learn languages and we change them as we learn them, and we learn them and so on. And this is a nice quote from Christensen and Chatter from their book Creating Language from 2016, saying that whatever learning and processing biases people happen to have will tend to become embedded in the structure of language because it will be easier to learn, to understand, and produce languages or specific linguistic forms that fit these biases. Okay. And talking about these two studies from the perspective of artificial language learning experiments, so from the methodological perspective that this workshop is about, I think they show how useful this paradigm is. This kind of host of paradigms is for different purposes. So in the first study, using an artificial language learning experiment allows us to compare the learnability of different language systems. And of course, this is something that we cannot do. We cannot compare the learnability of actual natural languages. Natural languages are, in the circumstances in which they are learned, are messy and confounded. And artificial language learning can allow us a controlled environment to do such a comparison. It also allows us, in theory at least, to compare different types of learners. So it didn't work in practice in this case, but in theory, it allows us the option to do so. And in the second study, using an artificial language learning experiment provided an experimental replication of a diachronic process. And this is important because we only have that many documented cases of language change, and replicating a process in the lab gives a very important and profound support to a postulated language change process. And it is the only way to couple such a postulated language change process with a cognitive mechanism. So we cannot see learning or processing or communication or whatever when we look at the way grammars change. The only way we can link cognitive biases to language change is to test these processes in the lab. And finally, in this experiment, in the second experiment, we saw how an artificial language learning experiment can actually highlight a distinction that was not made previously in the literature. So specifically in the DOM literature, there were basically two accounts that were kind of lumped together to seemingly suggest the same thing, but the experiment actually supported only one of them, namely the hypothesis where word order plays a mediating role and not the other. So this shows again how artificial language learning experiments can really complement and contribute the more standard linguistic literature. And this is it. That's all I have to say. I would like to thank the funds and the organizations that supported this research, and thank you all for listening. And I'm looking forward to hear your questions and thoughts about this.
Thanks, Shira. That was great. I just loved that last slide. It was really, really nice. Okay, so I'll let you take your own questions if that's okay. You're welcome to keep your slides if you think people might want clarification, or you can put them down because that's the only way you can see anybody. So
I see some, but I'm sorry if I'm missing some. So I see Slego.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Hi, I can, yeah.
I was really interested in the point you brought up on like the second to last slide about learning versus communication. I was wondering if you could just maybe talk about that a little bit more. And I wanted to know if you had any plans for additional studies that introduced interaction or iterated learning or anything with differential object marking.
So in fact, Jenny Culverton and Kenny Smith have a study just about that. So maybe I'll let Jenny answer this question. No, because I mean, you have a study about the difference between learning and communication with respect to DOM, but not involving atypical information structure or information structure at all, but only animacy.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think there are now a handful of studies, a bunch of them coming out of the Center for Language Evolution, that look at what kinds of effects learning have on language versus communication. So we do this by using methodologies where you can design a kind of learning only condition and compare that to a condition that has learning and communication. So sometimes those designs are iterated, sometimes they aren't. The particular study that Shira is talking about wasn't iterated because we were kind of following the original Fereshkina et al. Work. But there's a lot of additional work that Kenny has done that uses an iterated approach. And we've done this to look at sign language type structure emergence as well as spoken language structure emergence. So it's usually kind of very general properties of language like compositional structure and stuff like that. So I think these kinds of approaches are sort of ripe for being used in, for kind of more specific linguistic questions around particular phenomenon. I don't know if that answers your question, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. I was just interested in hearing more about it. Thanks.
I think generally the idea is that these cognitive biases can push languages to different directions. And there's a lot of work coming from Edinburgh showing that indeed they push languages to different directions. So with respect to DOM, it could be that, so the study suggests that disambiguation is actually not that important for learning, but it is important for communication.
Yeah, I think what Shira says is kind of the general finding that what learning does is make things simpler to learn. So processes that are, things that are related to simplicity emerge via learning. But there's a counteracting pressure, obviously, which is to not have your language be completely ambiguous. And so communication provides a kind of counterbalance to that. So you end up getting systems that are interestingly structured in a way such that they are good for learning and also good for our communication.
Yeah, go ahead, Andras. And then Elizabeth. I'm happy I can see some hands. I mean, that I actually can see them. Andras, you're welcome to ask a question.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thanks for the nice talk. I was wondering about how you introduced givenness in your experiments by showing one of the characters first. So there are some languages in which, probably at a later stage in the paths that you talked about, where information structure doesn't seem to play a role synchronically in the differential marking system, but say definiteness does.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether there was a way to distinguish whether the effect that you saw there was really introduced some kind of givenness, or whether it could be interpreted as definiteness right away, right? Because those can be teased apart sometimes. But yeah, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in fact, following a very similar remark we received from Mora a few years ago, not days ago, we checked that. So we had like a smaller study where we asked participants, so we taught them the same language, and then by the end of the day, like at the end of the session of the experiment, we asked them to translate the sentences they learned to English. And by doing that, we could see kind of how they treat in terms of definiteness, how they treat the objects and the subjects in a different condition. And what we found was that there was no difference. So actually, some participants kind of translated it as the waiter punched the chef, and some said something like waiter punching chef. But the manipulation we had did not translate into a manipulation of definiteness. So that was cool. It enables us to see that it's not about definiteness.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Okay, just making sure that Teams will show my face. I have a sort of like half-formed question or uncertainty about information structure driving the emergence of DOM. Like, this seems kind of surprising to me, this hypothesis, so maybe there's just something that I'm missing that you can fill me in on. But like, information structure seems to depend a lot on, your individual situations, like the communicative need in your particular situation. And the information structures that are hypothesized to drive DOM are the atypical ones, right? So they're infrequent. So I guess it's surprising to me that this would become frequent enough to lead to this kind of grammaticalization. Can you help me here?
Yeah, I can try. I hope I can help. The idea is more generally, so not only with respect to information structure, that it's the atypical objects that receive marking to begin with. So that's also true for animate objects. Why, I mean, inanimate, yeah, animate are the atypical in that sense. So why do we mark animate objects? Because it's less frequent. And there's a recent study that re-examined this and showed that indeed animate objects are less frequent, and given information typically appears in the subject position and not in the object position. A study by Natalia Levshina. So indeed, we see this skewed distribution in the way we talk about things, and that the skewed distribution matches oppositely how we mark objects and subjects. So we tend to mark the atypical. The atypical entity tends to receive marking. So that's true for animacy, for definiteness, and also for information structure. And you see cross-linguistically that a lot of languages do that. They mark atypical objects, so given objects. But interestingly, the claim is that even beyond that, in many systems, it starts out from being conditioned by information structure. And then the grammaticalization process is that, I think I have a slide about this. Wait. I had a shortcut. Yes, I do. Okay. No, it didn't work. Okay, I'll find it. Wait, maybe I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again. Sorry. That would simply be more comfortable to show it. Oh crap, it's loading from the start now. There it is. Okay. So, do you see the slide? Yeah. How does it work? So these are scales that must be familiar to many of you. So I was saying that object marking, it's not random. It's typically associated to typical properties of the object. But a crucial insight of typological research is that the properties themselves are not random. So some properties are more associated, are more typical of objects, and some properties are more typical of subjects. So here, the more left you are on the scale, the more subject-like you are, and the more right you are on the scale, the more object-like you are. And when you're the more subject-like you are, if you're not a subject, you're predicted to be marked. That's a weird way of saying that objects that are human or definite or given or all of the above tend to be marked. So that's like basically a visual way of understanding why animate objects tend to be marked and given objects tend to be marked. But what's also interesting about this when you see the scale is that these properties tend to cluster together. So human entities also tend to be definite and given. And the idea is that marking that started out by being conditioned by givenness, by information structure, over time is being reanalyzed as being conditioned by animate properties, so humanness or animacy in general. So I guess the idea is that this marking is must be more stable when it's latched on to semantic properties that are somewhat more stable than context-dependent properties, as you said before. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, Jorge, I think I don't see the name.
Sorry, could I just add a follow-up to
Elizabeth's
question,
Andres,
if I may? Sorry.
Yeah. Sure.
So another way of looking at it, I think, because of this question of why would a a property that is kind of rare or atypical on objects, how would that be grammaticalized, right? So one way of maybe getting rid of that rareness or rarity there is, I think Dalrymple and Nikolaeva, which you also had on the slide somewhere, they actually suggest that the fact that topicality on objects triggers some kind of marking might not necessarily mean that they are atypical as objects, but that marking is typical for salient things in information structure. So they argue, okay, we know that subjects often appear in first positions in a sentence. We know that they're often topical, so maybe those properties are just associated with topicality. So rather than an atypical object being marked, so to speak, an object that has those properties, an object that has those salient information structural properties will be marked in a way similar to how a subject is marked that has those properties. It's a kind of different way of looking at it. But so in the introductory chapter of that book, they kind of go into that a bit.
Yeah, I know. I mean, they have this a specific notion about the impact of information structure on object marking. They divide objects to being, I don't remember the terms now, like secondary given as opposed to first way given or something like that. But if I understand correctly what you're saying, then, and maybe I don't, but we can look at the fact that objects in atypical positions receive marking it can be kind of thought of similarly. It's like something atypical receiving more linguistic material, just like we thought that atypical objects will receive marking. We can think about atypical objects and objects that appear in atypical position as atypicality receiving more marking. Is that what you thought about, or was I taking it to a completely different direction?
Kind of. I think so. One way of I think they kind of want to get away from this notion of atypicality and just say that, subjects are topical. So if objects are topical, they will tend to be expressed in a similar way in terms of position, let's say, and in terms of some kind of marking. But it's just, I mean, it's just one approach that,
yeah.
I have a very tiny question. So I have a question about the givenness experiment. And it relates to, how do you conceive the impact that the fact that English has, English would typically use pronouns, right?
Right.
In those positions. English, not only English, I guess like many languages would use pronouns in the given positions. And pronouns in English have case marking, like morphological case.
Pronouns have
case.
Case. Yeah. Okay.
Case. So they are like different for different cases, right? So I was thinking like to which extent like the fact that it's a little bit odd to use full DPs to begin with in those cases, and that there is a competitor which is a pronoun might have had an impact on your results. I know that it's not maybe like direct, but yeah, if you think that you would do it, like, and I also think that this is interesting for the purposes of the more general like hypothesis, because we know that pronouns tend to maintain case marking in languages that have lost case marking elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it would be kind of a dumb like case. You have like case. It's not differential, but you have case in one particular for one particular type of word, and it might be that you need it like for certain purposes, But yeah, my was just about like the experiment.
So you're right that it's not. So to begin with, it's not the natural state of affairs to have NPs all over the place anyhow, because you would usually populate a given entity with a pronoun, not only in English. And in fact, this hypothesis here about the impact of information structure on DOM suggests that pronouns are the first one to be the first to be affected. So the idea is that topicalized pronouns, so pronouns appearing in the non-canonical positions, are the first to receive object marking, and then it spreads over to the rest of the rest of the chain. But as you know, implementing pronouns in artificial language learning experiments is difficult, and it's like a further complication one can do. So the purpose here was to see simply the manipulation of information structure at play. But yeah, I mean, it's weird to begin with. It's not natural to have sorry, NPs in objects, both in the object and in the subject position, and especially have them in the given object position. But in a way, since the manipulation here of givenness was not purely linguistic, I mean, I think it's weird in the example I showed you with Helena. So I met Helena. Helena is so nice. We typically use a pronoun there. But here the manipulation is more subtle in that sense. So hopefully it manipulates givenness without being weird on that front. But yeah, the prediction is that pronouns should be there, and they're actually the first to be affected.
Yeah, yeah, and also, I mean, I guess in your experiment you had the subject and the object were sometimes, like, for example, same gender, right? They were like,
they were
not.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. If we would use a pronoun, we had to fix that.
Yeah, because the thing is that maybe you wouldn't use a pronoun if you have like things that are ambiguous.
Yeah.
Like you have yeah. I mean, in the case of Elena, yes, we had the first person, but like
yeah. Jenny.
Yeah, I also have a kind of vaguely formed question, but I'm wondering, like, I mean, so doing these kinds of very complex experiments with kids is probably not something that one could do. But I was just wondering if you like have any thoughts about like how to kind of like would you expect kids to do something different in this experiment given
the
what you
information
thought
structure
about
experiments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, given what you think about how kids and adults might sort of learn these things differently or treat them differently.
I didn't think this through about this experiment, but kind of off my head, I don't have, I think, different predictions for children in this experiment because as far as I know, the given before new preference is evident for kids. Okay, maybe I do have different predictions for kids because I think it's not established yet or at all. It's quite established for adults that they tend to overmark atypical linguistic elements in different levels of linguistic analysis. Whether kids do it, we don't know. And my hunch is that they don't do it to the same degree, at least that it's learnable. So in that sense, if you decompose this to these two different tendencies, then I'm really not sure. I'm more positive about the given before new thing, but not so much about the marking atypical associations. But it's I am not aware of anyone doing the kind of the regularization paradigm on children anyhow. So from a methodological perspective, that's also, who knows what children will do.
I've done that.
No, oh yeah, you have. I mean, yeah, you have.
I mean, it's horrible. I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend that anyone actually do it, but it can be done.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, sorry, long experiments where you teach them 2-word orders and optional object marking and so on. But yeah. Akira, go ahead. I'm not sure if I'm saying the first name or the family name, but go ahead. Hi.
Oh, you're Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I can now.
Okay. I have a general sort of question. So I think you use a semi-artificial language in your experiment at the museum with the children. with Hebrew words and artificial sort of suffixes. And I wonder if you could compare that, but sort of semi-artificial languages and sort of fully artificial languages, and just how they work differently. Because I think because I know that semi-artificial language is going to be easier to sort of learn and given a specific time frame. But I also want to know what sort of things you have to think about when you sort of design semi-artificial languages.
Yeah. So I guess it depends on your question, right? So I think Jenny was bringing up this point yesterday in one of the talks or workshops. Here, I wasn't very interested in how children or how participants learned the lexicon. So the lexicon was semi-artificial. It was composed of Hebrew nouns with weird suffixes. But the language was very weird. So you could argue that, sorry, you could argue that it could have, illicit kind of associations. Yeah, I'll stop sharing in the meantime. Kind of illicit experience from your L1 more if you do that. But I taught them this language that had words that resembled Hebrew, but it was very non-Hebrew-like. So the word order, for starters, and this is what I was interested in, how they learned to understand who's doing what to whom, and this works in this language. It worked completely differently than Hebrew, and it had this weird suffixes again to indicate that there's something different here. So we use the alien story for kids. We say that they're going to learn an alien language. It might remind them of Hebrew, but as they'll see, it's very weird. But yeah, it's a compromise you make. It's one of the compromises you have to make when you want to facilitate learning for the interest of time or for getting children to learn the language. And it has been done. It's been done often with kids. But yeah, I mean, I would be happy at some point to replicate this with full-blown artificial lexicon and have them for a longer time in the lab.
Can I follow up on that just very quickly?
Yeah.
Because I think this is I think this is a very interesting issue, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's something a lot of people are kind of wondering about. To what degree does the lexicon need to be artificial? And I think we probably mentioned at some point already that, as far as I know, there are not studies that sort of directly compare this. So it would certainly be interesting to have such a study, because right now we're kind of guessing on the basis of our intuitions. But I did want to just mention, and maybe I'm sure Jorge knows more about this than I do, because he works on multilingualism. But I do know that there are theories of second or third or whatever, more than three language acquisition, that have argued that the phonology of the words is has a kind of primary role in driving whether people how people kind of do transfer from the languages they know to a new language. So it's not as though, it's not, I don't think it goes without saying that this doesn't make a difference. So it's definitely something that's interesting to think about. And I think, if you can use a fully artificial language, then you should. I guess that's my feeling about it. So as Shira said, it's when you have cases where you really think it's not going to work otherwise, or maybe cases where you can see that the rest of the language is very dissimilar, so they will have to get over, kids in your experiment will have to get over the fact that it looks similar to Hebrew, because it isn't, in other important aspects. But I just wanted to say that, it's not necessarily a choice that has no consequences, and it's also something that's potentially an interesting thing to look at in and of itself.
What's also helpful is if the result you're looking for is unlike the natural language of the participants. So in the case of the redundancy study, they had this mirror images, right? Either the clown touching the painter or the painter touching the clown. And it so happens that if they follow the Hebrew rules, then they should pick the wrong one. So the fact that they picked the correct one is is nice, because it shows me that they did learn this new language, and I mean, they had to kind of inhibit Hebrew to learn it. So that's also, and you don't always have this. Sometimes you can only, I don't know, test English speaking participants on something that English has. But if you can disentangle the two, then that's great.
Can I also
I saw a question. Yeah.
So I just wanted to also follow up on this because, I mean, we have run into this directly in work with Jenny, actually, where we had a version, or Jenny had previously done a version with David, and he might talk about that tomorrow a bit, of an artificial language learning experiment using English words and playing around with word order and teaching participants a new word order, but with English lexicon. And in the end, I guess this is specifically what Shira was just saying, like, it was difficult to say what the transfer from English would look like, because on the one hand, you could say, well, if they're directly transferring English word order, then they'll put the words in the English order. But if they could also be doing a more structural transfer, which was actually what we were hoping to measure in these experiments. And then it was really difficult to say whether the transfer from English was, or whether there was transfer from English or not. And so then when we looked at the strategy reports of participants who did the version of the experiment using English words, indeed, a lot of participants were saying that they just flipped English words. So did some type of metalinguistic game with the English words that they recognized. And when we did the exact same type of experiment, but using a completely artificial lexicon, we didn't get a single report of people flipping from English. So they still may have done that, but they at least weren't aware of it in the same way. And so it's not a perfect comparison, but it was doing the same type of manipulation using either English lexicon or completely artificial lexicon that we had taught them in a previous training phase. And so, yeah, so sometimes this can really come up where you get the result that you want and you think you know where it comes from, but actually you can't totally exclude the fact that it's transferred from their native language. So yeah, so
it's worth saying. Yeah, sorry. And it's worth saying that sort of because of these concerns, we did try to do a version with children that was like this, but they had a terrible time learning the lexicon. So, it's a tricky one, especially when you're interested in looking at kids. I mean, I think when you're looking at adults, I mean, there's kind of no excuse. I did it. So it is what it is. But I think, like I said before, if you can avoid it, then that's the best. Okay, I see some other hands up.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't see the name anymore, but you can just unmute yourself and ask.
Maybe it's me. I don't know if there were more people. Now I was just weighing in on this last point, that to say that, yeah, in fact, I mean, what you need to think about is that these experiments are all by definition first exposure studies, right? If you think about language. And so there's a sink or swim reaction, swim or sink or swim reaction for everybody. I mean, there's going to be an approach to latch on to whatever they can to parse this in the best and most informative way possible. And that's where, I mean, that's, of course, this is my pet interest. So this is my focus and perspective and whatever, but there's always some role of previously acquired languages. There's always some role of previous knowledge. And because you're dealing with humans, they always have, even, the kids, they always have some stuff to use. And so there's this is going to happen, and to the extent that it's going to happen, you just need to make sure that it if and when it happens, where things are coming from, so that if you know that inevitably there's going to be some intermission of previous languages, that or at least that you have unbiased the context as much as possible by either using completely artificial lexicon if you can, if that works, by neutralizing any other. So like you have people that speak two previous languages, well, try to use a syntactic context in which they're the same, even if you're manipulating something else, things like that, so that you kind of, at least you give it your best shot at things being unbiased. And then if they go for one or the other, or if you see some influence from one or the other language, then that's going to happen. But at least you know where it comes from, because the more biased opportunities, the more ambiguous opportunities there are, or like points of entry for previous knowledge to kind of make their appearance, the more lost you will be in explaining where does this come from. I mean, it could be so, yeah.
Okay, so we're out of time, but thanks very much to Shira and to the rest of you for asking great questions. Yeah, well done.
Thank you.
So we now have a lunch break for an hour and a half, and we'll come back for Shira's tutorial with Kenny at 1:30 UK time. Okay, see you all soon.